finally done talking about the nervous system. We are ready, after what feels like a month talking about the nervous system, to move on to a new system. Okay, the endocrine system is our next system. You can see pictured here on the first page. We have lots and lots of different glands labeled, some organs. Some of them we will talk about, some of them we will not. Okay, we won't talk about like the skin or the lungs or the heart at this point. Does that mean some of those organs do not participate in our part of the endocrine system? No, we're going to kind of stick to what we'd call the most, well, I won't even say that. We'll stick to just some of the organs that you see here. Okay. Think back to our very first lecture. I introduced to you guys a little bit about the endocrine system. And I said at that point, it's one of the two major systems most responsible for maintaining homeostasis. The other being the nervous system that we just talked about. So that's why we've been spending our last few weeks talking nervous and now endocrine before we get into any other system of the body. And we control all those other systems using our nervous system and endocrine system. Okay. The endocrine system, as we learned in our very first lecture, involves the release of chemicals called hormones from our various endocrine glands. Hormones are released into our interstitial fluids that surround our secretory cells. Those hormones then typically diffuse into the blood from those interstitial fluids, where they're then transported in our blood to target cells throughout the body. Okay. Typically, our body synthesizes hormones in one part of the body, but then transports the hormones to another part of the body using the bloodstream or lymph, and therefore endocrine glands are going to have a rich blood supply. And when those hormones get to their target organs and target cells, they have the capability of altering the metabolism of them by either increasing or decreasing their activities. Regardless, these changes in activity are strictly balanced in order to help maintain homeostasis. Okay. What we will call our kind of true or major endocrine glands are the pituitary, the thyroid, the 4 parathyroids, the two adrenals, and the singular pineal gland. Okay, some of those we've kind of mentioned before, like the pineal gland. We've mentioned a little bit about the pituitary. When I say that they are true or major, it means that that's all they do is produce hormones. They have no other job whatsoever than to produce hormones. Okay. But in addition to those, we do have several other organs and tissues that are not exclusively classified as endocrine glands, but they do contain cells that secrete hormones. So these are kind of like the secondary endocrine organs. And there are many of them. You can see they're listed here at the bottom. We're not going to talk about all of them at this point in the semester, but we will talk about the hypothalamus, your thymus, the pancreas, a little bit about the ovaries in females, the testes in males. I will mention a hormone from the kidneys, but we won't really get into the kidneys too much. We won't talk stomach, liver, small intestine at this point, nor will we talk about the skin, heart, adipose tissues, or placenta. Okay. Does that mean later on the semester, when we talk about these organs, like the stomach, the liver, and small intestine, and our digestive system, we will talk a little bit about those hormones that they produce. Okay, just not quite yet. You're going to have plenty others from these other ones that I'm going to make sure you know. As a whole, we can say that our endocrine system provides us with 6 major areas of control and integration. Number 1, responses to stress and injury. Number 2, metabolism when it comes to energy, growth and development, water and electrolyte balance, absorption of nutrients, and then reproduction, birth, and lactation. I've already mentioned this, but recalling from previous lectures, and it was the very first lecture of the semester, 2 main systems of the body most responsible for maintaining homeostasis are the nervous and endocrine systems. These 2 systems share several properties, but also contain contrasting properties. So in other words, they're similar in some ways, but also very different in others. But they do work together to function in a coordinated manner. So since we've spent so much time talking about the nervous system, I wanted to kind of see here, and this table is really nice at demonstrating similarities and differences between the two systems. First of all, the nervous system, strictly as far as chemicals go, it's neurotransmitters like acetylcholine, norepinephrine, released in response to nerve impulses. When it comes to the endocrine system, we're talking hormones delivered to tissues throughout the body by blood. The site of action for the nervous system is very, very specific and close to the site of release. In other words, where the synapse is, the neurotransmitter is going across the cleft to just maybe a few cells. Okay. Whereas in the case of the endocrine system, we can be dumping hormones into the blood, like up in our brain, and those hormones might have to go all the way to the other side of the body. So the site of action could be very far from the site of release. Okay. Types of target cells for the nervous system include muscle, that's smooth cardiac skeletal, gland cells, and other neurons. Whereas the endocrine system, it basically could be any cells throughout the body. The nervous system is very, very quick. And we know that, thinking about what we've talked about, like touching a hot stove, it's almost instantaneous. Okay. Whereas with the endocrine system, it's much more delayed. It sometimes takes seconds to hours or days. You want to think about like a comparison between the two, your nervous system is like communicating by sending a text message. You know, like when you type a text message, you hit send, as long as all the signaling is good, that message is going to be pretty much digging in their phone almost instantly. Whereas if you send a letter in the old-fashioned mail system, where you actually have to use it to circulate through the postal service, maybe flying in the air, riding in a truck cross country, can take days, and that's like hormones traveling through the bloodstream. Okay, duration of action, so how long the action lasts, is very brief. Once again, milliseconds is what we always deal with the nervous system, whereas with the endocrine system, it's generally longer, as in seconds to days. Okay, what we're going to be talking about for, I would say, the majority of this lecture is just hormones. So just kind of introducing hormones a little bit more to you here. Let's talk about the definition of hormones and how they work to lead us through for the next several slides. Hormones can be defined as regulatory molecules endocrine glands secrete into the blood. They then travel through the bloodstream, allowing them to travel throughout the entire body. Now, they don't always get picked up by the blood, as we'll find out in a minute. Sometimes they don't have to travel in our blood, but most of our hormones do. Okay. What's amazing is that hormones, despite the fact that they might reach many different target tissues and target cells, they only affect specific target tissues, and it has to do with receptors for those specific hormones. Okay, so for example, the big toe and the uterus can both receive the hormone estradiol, but that hormone released by the ovaries in females only acts on the uterus, not the big toe, and that's because the uterus has the actual receptors, whereas the big toe does not have the receptors for it. Okay, and it has everything to do with shape of both the hormones and the receptors. Thinking back a few weeks ago, we talked about enzymes and how they had a lock and key mechanism. Hormones work the same way, where specific shapes for hormones only fit in specific shapes of receptors, like a specific shaped key only fits in a specific shaped lock. Same situation exists with hormones. I know this figure is kind of small, but we can see hormones being rejected by some cells because they don't have the correct receptors, whereas target cells will have those specific receptors. Okay. Now, speaking of receptors, we are constantly synthesizing and breaking those down. Okay, so the number of receptors a cell has can fluctuate. It can be as few as 2,000 to as many as 100,000, okay, for a particular hormone. Down regulation is where the number of target cell receptors decreases. That's what we're showing here in figure A, going from several to just a few. This is what is done when there's an excess amount of a hormone. Okay, if you have a whole bunch of hormone, you don't need as many receptors. And so this is going to make the receptors less sensitive to the hormones. Okay. Whereas if you have a deficiency of a hormone, so there's like very little hormone in the blood, you're going to upregulate. You're going to increase the number of receptors, and that is going to increase the likelihood that a hormone is going to bind to one of those receptors, so it makes the receptors more sensitive to the hormones. So down regulation, when we have a bunch of hormone, we want to make them less sensitive to hormones. Upregulation is the opposite, where there's little hormone and we need to make those receptors that we do have more sensitive. All right, for the next few slides, I want to talk about the different ways that we classify hormones. The first way to classify hormones is based on their method of circulation in our body fluids. Okay, so in other words, how they circulate in our fluids. The first classification based on hormone circulation is what we call circulating hormones, meaning that they circulate in our blood throughout the body. I would highlight this phrase. This is what most hormones are. Most hormones are circulating. Okay. And so I've already been telling you this, but hormones are generally released from the cell into the interstitial fluid and then picked up by the blood, where they're then carried to distant target cells. Okay. I just said that's not always the case. That's what local hormones would fall into. I'll get to those here in a second. Okay. Circulating hormones can linger in the blood and exert their effects for a few minutes or occasionally a few hours. However, over time, they become inactivated by the liver and will be excreted by the kidneys unless you have kidney or liver failure, which can lead to excess levels of hormones in the blood. Local hormones are named local because they act locally. In other words, they don't actually have to enter the bloodstream and instead act on a cell nearby, a neighboring cell, or they actually can act on themselves. Okay. Paracrine are what we show here with it is actually these two cells, where a cell called a paracrine cell is releasing the hormone that then travels just to a very nearby cell. No blood has to be used to carry that hormone to a nearby target cell where it then produces a response. Okay, examples of paracrine hormones include prostaglandins, and then that's short NO there for nitric oxide, which we'll talk a little bit about, not a whole lot. Autocrine, if you remember, we've seen this prefix auto mean before. Auto means self. So autocrine hormones actually act on the same cell that produces them. Okay, the hormone is released and then it binds to receptors on that same cell. And then the response occurs internally within that same cell. So it seems kind of weird, but that's what happens. No matter what, if it's paracrine or autocrine, local hormones are inactivated quickly. Okay, so they don't produce really drastic responses. They're important in their own right, but we'll spend the majority of our time here in this lecture talking about circulating. Okay. So that's how we can classify hormones based on circulation. We can also classify them based on their chemical makeup. So how they're chemically put together. And there are two classes of hormones based on their chemical makeup. Those that are soluble in lipids, what we literally call the lipid-soluble hormones, and those that are soluble in water, what we would literally call the water-soluble. Okay. These classes of hormones exert their effects differently, and that's what we'll kind of talk about here for the next several slides. Here on this page, we see what we call the lipid-soluble hormones. Okay. Lipid soluble hormones, a key feature of them is that when they circulate in our bloodstream, they need an Uber. They need a cab to get them or ferry them from their secretory cells to their target cells. Because remember, things that are lipid soluble, like steroid hormones, steroids are fats. Remember how water and fat get along? Not very well, right? Okay. And about half of your blood, guess what it is? Water. Okay. So when in our blood, lipid soluble hormones need an Uber, what we call transport protein, to get to their target cells. Okay. 3 types of lipid soluble hormones, actually, excuse me, 4 types are listed here. Steroid hormones, which we learned earlier in the semester, steroids are synthesized from cholesterol. Each steroid hormone is unique due to the presence of different chemical groups attached at various sites on the 4 rings at the core of its structure. That's actually what's pictured there in the figure. They're lipid soluble, therefore can easily pass through the plasma membrane of target cells, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Examples of steroid hormones include your important sex hormones, estrogens, progesterone in females, testosterone in men. There are 2 thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. They are produced by the thyroid, derived from what we call tyrosine, a nonpolar amino acid. They're the only hormones that actually include iodine as part of their structure. Not that that's really that important to know. Nitric oxide, which is a gaseous hormone. It's also a neurotransmitter in other places, synthesized by an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase. That's that NO that you saw a slide ago. And then icosanoid hormones, derived from a 20-carbon fatty acid, are important local hormones that may act as circulating hormones as well. They include chemicals known as prostaglandins and leukotrienes. We won't really talk too much about those. I think there's just like one slide where we'll mention those towards the end of the lecture. Okay. When we talk about lipid soluble hormones, the most common types that we'll talk about fall into the first 2 categories, the steroids and the thyroids. Okay. Now, looking at this illustration, we show that lipid soluble hormones need a transport protein, whereas water soluble hormones, they don't. They can circulate in the blood in what we would call the free form, which means that they're not attached to other molecules. Two types of water soluble hormones include the amines and the peptide/protein category. Amines are derived by decarboxylating, which is just a fancy word to say that we're removing CO2 from certain amino acids. We call them amines because what they're left with when the CO2 is removed is just the amino group. So I don't know why they don't call them amino hormones, but they call them amine hormones. But that includes epi, norepi that we've talked about before. We've mentioned a little bit about dopamine, histamine, serotonin, melatonin, which we've talked about before. That's that timekeeping hormone released in our brain that helps us fall asleep. So some of those hopefully ring a bell. Peptide/protein hormones are made up of amino acids in polymer form. So in other words, just chains of amino acids. If the chains are short, in other words, between 3 and 49, we'd call it a peptide hormone. If they're between 50 amino acids and as many as 200, we'd call it a protein hormone. So in other words, peptides are just smaller than proteins. Okay. Examples of peptides include antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, and then protein hormones include thyroid stimulating growth hormone, insulin. What we see is a lot of those protein hormones are attached to carbohydrate groups, which we would actually call them glycoprotein hormones. Now, just to kind of summarize those 2 categories, lipid soluble, water soluble, is this table on the next page. What I'm not going to ask you to do is, for example, know where melatonin or serotonin or parathyroid hormone falls in. Okay. What you will need to know, though, is like amine hormones, peptide protein hormones are water soluble. That steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, nitric oxide, icosanoids are lipid soluble. So know the major categories don't know like the specific hormones. Make sense? Okay. Now let's talk about how those two different types of hormones operate, or how do they produce their effects when they make it to their target cells. We'll start by talking about lipid-soluble hormones. Once again, those are the ones that have to use the Uber, the transport protein, for proteins synthesized in liver that have the following functions. They make lipid solubles temporarily water soluble. They retard the loss of these hormones in the kidneys. So in other words, we pee out less of those hormones, less of that hormone is lost in our urine. And they help provide a ready reserve of the hormones in the bloodstream. Okay. Now I'm going to jump ahead to the next page to talk about how they produce their response. Okay, how do they affect the target cell? So at the top, you can see we have our hormone shown in green being transported by a transport protein in the bloodstream. There's the Uber. When you ride in an Uber, when you get to your destination, you get out, right? Well, that's what happens to those hormones when they get to their target cell. They diffuse out of the blood. The transport protein stays in the blood, goes, picks up a new passenger. The hormones, since they are lipid soluble, have a easy ability to come into the cell. Remember, the plasma membrane of a cell, the outer boundary of a cell, is predominantly made up of phospholipids, right? And I've told you guys this before, but fats travel through fats just fine, right? Okay, so things like steroid hormones, testosterone, estrogen are able to go directly into the cell, okay? Which means they can then go directly to the nucleus to bind to receptors there, okay? And in doing so, they alter what we call gene expression, which, if you remember what gene expression is, let me do this, is where you go from DNA to RNA. And then what do you make with RNA? Proteins, okay? So looking at what happens, we turn on specific DNA, which triggers the making of specific RNA, which ends up making the protein. And as we said before, if something's happening in the body, chances are a protein's doing it, right? Well, if I go back to my screen here, we can see what's happening. So we alter gene expression, DNA triggers the making of RNA, RNA then triggers the making of the protein, and here's the ultimate takeaway. That newly formed protein is what alters the cell's activity. Don't really care what that activity is, but by making the protein, the cell produces a specific response. Okay. Now, do you need to know all four of those steps? No. What you'll want to make sure you know is that, you know, when it comes to lipid soluble hormones, they're acting on nuclear receptors. Okay. They involve transport proteins. And then this last sentence down here at the bottom, these guys act very strongly, but do so very slowly. Their actions take hours to days, and their effects can be very long lasting. When it comes to water soluble hormones, it's a little more complicated. Not for how they're transported very easily. Remember, water soluble don't need a transport protein, but they cannot diffuse through the lipid bilayer, okay, which prevents them from going directly into the cells and altering nuclear receptors. Instead, they operate using one of those second messenger systems, just like we learned the other day with the sense of smell. Okay, so here's what that illustration looks like, okay, or that process looks like. Okay, here's our free form hormones. No Uber has to carry them. They leave the bloodstream to leave and enter the interstitial space, but instead of going directly in the cell, they bind to a receptor on the plasma membrane. The first of our two messengers is the hormone binding to that receptor, okay? Then we activate the domino effect. G protein triggers adenylyl cyclase, which converts ATP to cyclic AMP. And there's our second messenger, okay? Cyclic AMP serves as a second messenger to activate what we call protein kinases. Protein kinases are enzymes that take a protein and add a phosphate from ATP to it. So what you end up with is a protein and a phosphate, okay? And in doing so, what you've done is altered a protein, which then produces the physiological response, okay? So it's pretty similar to what we just learned with regards to lipid soluble. It all centers around proteins. In the case of lipid soluble, we produce new proteins that then alter the cell's activity. In the case of water soluble, we phosphorylate proteins. So we just change the protein by adding a phosphate to it that activates it, and that's what produces the physiological response. Okay. Now, while this is taking place, you can see there's a sixth step. There's an enzyme called phosphodiesterase. You don't really need to know this, but it inactivates cyclic AMP. And why I bring that up is because these guys, although very quick to act, seconds to minutes, the effects are short-lived, which I would highlight that sits at the bottom. Okay. Now, just like what I said with lipid soluble hormones, are you going to need to know, in this case, the 6 steps? No. Definitely going to want to know that water soluble hormones utilize a second messenger system. Water soluble hormones cannot diffuse and thus must act on the target cell's plasma membrane, whereas in lipid soluble, they can go directly into the nucleus and alter gene expression. So it's a little different. Same result, basically anyways, protein production or alteration in this case, but the proteins produce a response, which once again demonstrates how important proteins are in our body. If something's getting done, chances are it's a protein doing it. All right, let's talk about hormone responsiveness. Since I haven't defined it for you, I'm going to do that now. This from the other day. Responsiveness, if I could spell it correctly, with regards to hormones, basically means, if you want to think of it this way, how much or how strong of an effect, what response a hormone produces. How much or how strong of an effect that hormone produces, triggers, elicits, whatever you want to say. I try not to use the same root of a word, so I try not to use response, but effect / response, same thing. Okay, so that's what responsiveness is. And responsiveness of a target cell to a hormone is dependent upon 3 things: the concentration of that hormone, the abundance of the target cell's hormone receptors. And actually, if we go back a couple slides, we talked about this already, okay? Upregulation, downregulation, we're talking about getting less or more sensitive. Okay, that stuff is what we mean when we're talking about responsiveness. Okay. And then number 3, other hormones can influence a hormone's responsiveness. Okay. Speaking of, let me read through. In addition, actions of some hormones on target cells require a simultaneous or recent exposure to a second hormone. Okay. We have what we call synergism, permissiveness, and antagonism. And we've got 3 graphs demonstrating those different effects. Now you can see synergistic effect is the same thing as synergism. Permissive effect, same thing as permissiveness. Antagonistic effect, same thing as antagonism. Okay. Synergism or synergistic effect is where the combination of hormones are going to have a greater effect on a target cell than the sum of the effects each would have if acting alone. Okay. In anatomy the other day, we talked about synergists, which were muscles that work at the same time as the prime mover to make a more efficient contraction, right? Okay. Well, I told you guys in that class, synergy, it's like working together as a team. Okay. If you work together as a team, generally you're going to be more efficient and you're going to produce something that's, better than if you worked each by yourself. Hormones work that way. Okay. Not all, but some do. Like in our illustration down at the bottom, we're measuring the hormone J, hormone K responsiveness. So we're measuring how much of a response. So this is responsiveness that's being measured. Okay, and then that's over a factor of time. So over time, if just hormone J or hormone K, we don't really care what those hormones are. If they are acting alone, they don't really do a whole lot. Okay, but if you put them together, look at the response that they produce. Something very strong, or very effective response has been produced. Okay, more so than even just adding them together if they were acting alone. Okay. Permissiveness or a permissive effect occurs when a small amount of one hormone allows a second hormone to have its full effect on a target cell. So think permissive, it's like going to permit something else to do its job. Okay. Hormone A by itself produces a weak response, but when added with a permissive hormone, a really strong response occurs. Okay. Example of a permissiveness or permissive effect occurs when epinephrine, which alone weakly stimulates the breakdown of fat, but when small amounts of T3 and T4, the thyroid hormones, are present, that same amount of epinephrine stimulates breakdown of fat much more powerfully. Okay. And then antagonism, we talked about antagonistic muscles in that same anatomy lecture. An antagonist opposes something. In this case, antagonism is where hormones produce opposite effects on one another. So in other words, they oppose one another, like in the case of hormone X and hormone K. Okay, if X and Y, not A and K. Hormone Y, very little of it allows hormone X to produce a great response. But as hormone X diminishes, that enables hormone Y to produce a much stronger response. Okay. Examples of this are insulin and glucagon, both released by the same organ, the pancreas. You guys know what insulin and glucagon are responsible for maintaining? Blood sugar. Okay. Insulin, anybody know? Does it make your blood sugar go up or down? Down. Okay. So like you release insulin after you eat, especially something sugary. Glucagon is what we release when our blood sugar is really low. And the function of these two hormones with their opposing effects is to help fine-tune things like your blood sugar. We see the same thing for blood calcium. We have two different hormones that helps you keep those control conditions like blood glucose or blood calcium levels really, really close to that set point. Okay. At least that's the idea behind it anyway. Okay, let's talk hormone release. The release of most hormones occurs in short bursts with little or no secretion occurring between bursts. Okay, so it's just kind of spit out a little bit at a time. Okay, and the secretion of these hormones is regulated by kind of four things. In other words, four things can trigger hormones to be released. Thinking back to our last unit, we talked about how the nervous system can trigger the adrenal medulla. Remember which division of the nervous system can trigger the adrenal medulla? That fight or flight sympathetic nervous system, right? How it triggers the release of norepi, epi, and dopamine, most notably being epinephrine, what we commonly call adrenaline, right? So we've actually talked all about this example. Okay. I was just talking about how if your blood sugar is high, you'll release insulin. If your blood sugar is low, you release glucagon. Those are examples of number two, chemical changes in the blood. Now that's not what's shown here. Okay. They're showing in this case calcium levels in the blood. If they're low, they're going to release, or your body's going to release parathyroid hormone, PTH, from your parathyroid glands. Okay. And if parathyroid hormone elevates your blood calcium back to normal, what are we going to do? We're going to negatively feed back to the parathyroid to stop releasing PTH. Okay. We can see that negative symbol there demonstrating that this is negative feedback. Okay. Number three, distension of an organ or stretching of an organ can trigger the release of hormones, which is kind of wild, but we've actually talked about this one way back at the very beginning of the semester when we talked about the positive feedback loop associated with childbirth. The stretching of the cervix in a woman going through labor triggers the release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland, which results in stronger and more forceful contractions of the uterus. And this continues as more stretching of the cervix occurs, demonstrating once again that this is positive feedback. Okay. And then number four, other hormones can trigger the release of hormones. And what you'll see sometimes is you'll see a hormone being released by one organ that triggers the release of a hormone by another organ, and then that releases or triggers the release of a hormone from another organ. So it's kind of a, this one tells this one, that tells this one to actually release it. And that's what we see over here on the right with the anterior pituitary releasing what's called ACTH. We'll find out what that abbreviation is here later. It's a big, long word. Okay. That acts on the adrenal cortex to trigger the release of cortisol. Okay. And if cortisol levels are elevated, that's going to inhibit the secretion of that ACTH from the anterior pituitary. Okay. Now this illustration actually could go one level higher than it shows because the anterior pituitary doesn't release ACTH without a hormone actually being released from the hypothalamus first. And I always describe this relationship like what happens when you're in college and you're at a job, because when you're in college, generally you're not the boss, but you generally have a boss, and a lot of times your boss has a boss. You think about your boss's boss, they a lot of times tell your boss what to do, and then your boss turns around and instead of doing it himself, what's he do? Tells you to do it, right? And then since you're low man on the totem pole, because that's what happens when you're in college, you generally are the low man on the totem pole, you're the one that does the job. So in this case, the adrenal cortex is like low man on the totem pole. This is like the assistant manager, the anterior pituitary, and then the manager, or the boss's boss, is what we call the hypothalamus. Now, what we see here is two illustrations showing you negative feedback, which is how most hormonal regulatory systems work. Okay, there are a few. In this case, we show one of them, and that's the only one that we're really going to talk about, that operate by positive feedback, and that would be childbirth. All right, I think I'm going to stop here. I was hoping we'd get a little bit farther, but I'm going to stop a little early. I think it's going to be too hard to get this hypothalamus slide started and then just have to wait and pick up with it again, because we won't get through it all here in the next few minutes. So I just want to start fresh with it next week. We're doing pretty good, kind of coasting through this. Looks like we're about a third of the way done, and we just got an hour of it done. So I think we should be in pretty good shape on Tuesday, kind of kick things into gear and get through the rest of this. So we'll stop here for today and for the week, and I'll see you in a few days.